from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight, the Fed delivers its final rate cut of the year. The decision from Washington that Fed Chair Jay Powell says should help stabilize the labor market, along with his outlook for next year. President Trump's reaction immediately after. Why he says that cut should have been doubled. And the Fed chair candidate he's meeting with tonight. We'll dig into it all with our own Michael McKee, who is in the room, along with Betsey Stevenson, former chief economist for the Department of Labor in the Obama administration, all ahead. Plus, what the Fed says about the state of the economy just a day after the president celebrated his administration's actions on affordability while dismissing the crisis in Pennsylvania. We'll get reaction to that, an ongoing battle for Warner Brothers Discovery when we speak to Los Angeles Congresswoman Democrat Laura Friedman up ahead. And the major escalation this evening in the tensions between the U.S. and Venezuela. The president just now confirming our exclusive report from the region after U.S. forces seized a sanctioned oil tanker off the Venezuelan coast. What it means for the conflict, the oil sector, and the other moves the president says are all happening. We dig in now with news from Washington on the Fed meeting. It's last of the year, cutting interest rates by a quarter point. In a 9-3 vote, Fed Chair Jay Powell delivering remarks right after the decision was handed down, speaking to the three dissenting votes. Listen.
It's a close call. We have to make decisions. And we always hope that the data will give us a clear read. But in this situation, you have competing. If you look through the SEP, you'll see that a very large number of participants agree that risks are to the upside for unemployment and to the upside for inflation. So what do? You've got one tool. You can't do two things at once.
For all the details now, we bring in Bloomberg's Michael McKee. He's just made his way back, having been in the press room for today's news conference. Michael, it's great to see you. Some would argue this was the easy part today. What does the dot plot tell us about moving forward?
Dot plot actually doesn't change very much because they are predicting only one rate cut next year, at least the consensus median dot is, and that's where they were in September and June. So no real change there, except that when you look at the dot plot for 2025, which included today, there were 6 members who said they did not favor a rate cut. Now, only 3 of them voted, but 6 said they did not favor a rate cut. And then Stephen Myron was the 7th person because he wanted a 50 basis point cut. So you had 7 out of the 19 who did not agree with today's policy. It is certainly possible that you're going to see, well, let me put it this way. I wouldn't put any faith in the dot plot for next year because we're going to get all this data dumped next week. Then we're going to start getting more accurate data in January. Yeah. By the time we get to that January 29th meeting, we might have a better idea of which way the economy is going.
Frame your question for Jay Powell today.
Well, basically what I asked, I asked him 2 things. One, 10-year yields have been going up. The yield curve has been steepening. And so I asked, how is it that you're going to help the real estate business and others that depend on the 10-year rate? And he said, well, we don't know why they're moving up, but we don't think it's because of inflation.
We have that moment, as a matter of fact. Let's hear from the Fed chair right now, speaking with Michael McKee.
Why are rates going up? It has to be something else. It must be, an expectation of higher growth or something like that. And that's a lot of what's been going on. I mean, you saw a big move toward the end of last year, which was not to do with us. It was to do with other developments.
Which developments?
Well, that's a good question, especially with everything that is going on. But the higher growth thing, he did go on to say that, we're going to have some additional fiscal support for the economy with tax refunds next year. And they think that the higher prices from tariffs are going to work their way out of the economy in 6 to 9 months. And in general, the economy is in reasonable shape. They're predicting growth will go up significantly next year, the Fed is. So if it is a growth effort, then yields could go up if the markets are afraid of inflation. And, of course, the president in the Oval Office today said he doesn't know why we can't have 20 to 25% GDP growth.
What did you think about that? Toward the end of this back and forth with reporters, he made it clear that I guess we should have a Federal Reserve that does not want to hike interest rates to slow growth, suggesting that he would be okay with 20 to 25% GDP. What would happen to the economy with growth of that speed?
Well, I think my paycheck would go up. But beyond that, we would probably have enormous inflation unless we had productivity to quote the president, like you've never seen before. And I think it would be ridiculous to even conceive of something like that. So you can't do anything but really make fun of it. But the idea that the Fed shouldn't raise rates to slow growth would imply that the president says inflation is okay, because that's what the Fed does to bring inflation down, is it slows growth beyond the sustainable rate in the economy. And so it is, as always, hard to understand exactly what this president is saying.
It also means the next Fed chair is going to have an interesting experience at the FOMC. Bloomberg's Michael McKee with us in Washington on a Fed day. We thank you, Michael. For a look at how markets moved off today's Fed decision, we turn now to power moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who's live at World Headquarters in New York. Romaine?
Yeah, well, for the equity market, Joe, this was actually the best Fed decision day that we've had since March. The S&P came within a whisker of its all-time high. But we should point out, the Russell 2000, those are the small cap indexes, the ones that are most sort of tied to the cyclical nature of our economy and to interest rates. That closed at a record high. So too did the interest rate sensitive banks as measured by the KBW Bank Index. That's the equity side. I want you to take a look, though, at what happened in treasuries. We did see a drop in yields, and it gets to that last question that you were asking, Mike McKee, about the question that he posed to Jay Powell about why we continue to see long end rates continuing to move over, this steepening of the yield curve, if you will. Jay Powell said it was because of expectations for higher growth, but everyone we've spoken to on the close over the past few weeks has really talked about this idea of an increased term premium, the idea that most investors have a lot of uncertainty about what the future holds, and thus they want higher compensation in order to buy long-dated treasuries. And that has been a big part of the story of why we continue to see a steepening of that curve. Another big story here that also affects what's going to happen in the bond market is actually what's going on in the AI space, Joe. We had earnings just a few minutes ago from Oracle, a behemoth of a company, one that hit a record high back in September, but it has actually been down more than 30% since that all-time high, and it's drifted lower in the after-hours trade today, down by 6%. It has nothing to do with revenue growth. That's phenomenal. It has nothing to do right now with the backlog of orders. $500 billion worth, Joe. That is phenomenal. The concern is you take $500 billion of orders, you don't necessarily have the capacity to fulfill those orders. That means Oracle has to spend a lot of money to build out its AI infrastructure to meet that demand. And of course, that's going to require going to the debt markets to borrow money, Joe, and that has investors a little bit concerned.
Complicated story with Oracle right now. Romaine, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick with Power Moves. Just as Chair Powell was wrapping up his Q&A at the Fed, the president opened up what was previously a closed event with business leaders, commented on the Fed's decision, hitting inflation. Take a listen to the president's comments following the Fed chief afterward.
If there are no new tariff announcements, and we don't know that, but let's assume there are no major new tariff announcements, inflation from goods should peak in the first quarter or so, right, or roughly. You know, we haven't been able to predict this with any precision. No one is. But call it the first quarter or so of next year should be the peak.
We have to get a mindset that when a country is doing well, you don't want to kill the growth. That's what they're doing. They kill the growth. I don't know if you guys even agree with that. They kill the growth because they're so afraid of inflation. But you can have tremendous growth without inflation.
As much as 25%, he suggested. Joining us now with her reaction to today's rate decision and the comments from the president, Betsey Stevenson, public policy and economics professor at the University of Michigan, former chief economist at the Department of Labor in the Obama administration. Betsey, it's great to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio. Happy Fed Day. I don't even know where to start with you on this, because I know I'm supposed to ask you about interest rates and what the Fed did today, but can you just pick up on this conversation? What would happen to inflation with 25% GDP?
25% GDP growth? Look, I think that's too fast for, if that was happening in the annual rate, I think you just have a lot of adjustment costs. But I think that's also kind of a silly thing to guess about. I think that AI is going to give us faster growth. I'm an AI optimist, and I think that we are all going to be able to enjoy a higher living standard because of it, and we should start to prepare for that. But, I think we need to realize that not everybody is going to get lifted up at the same time. So let's imagine your scenario of 25% GDP growth. Let's not think about inflation. Well, let's think about what that means and who loses jobs, because that means some people are becoming so productive, other people are being laid off in droves. droves. And I think that's the real risk, is there are transition costs that come with really, really rapidly fast-changing economies. And I think we should be really worried about who might get left behind. But that's not our scenario right now. Particularly if you look at the labor market, that what Powell said is we're losing jobs, and he's worried about the labor market. And I think we should all pause and talk about that, because those are real people's lives.
Well, let's get into it. We've got 25 basis points today, 9-3 the vote. I'll ask the same question of you that Michael McKee asked Jay Powell right now. Is the Fed prioritizing the job market over inflation?
I think that the Fed has been trying to balance these two competing risks, and they've been doing a pretty good job of that. They're both real risks, and if they cut rates, they're risking inflation. And if they raise rates, they're risking a weak labor market. That's a trade-off that they're facing. Now, here's the problem. People are very frustrated about inflation, but not inflation the way you and I think about it. Like, is the rate of inflation down to 2% yet, or is it still up there at 3%? They're frustrated at the price level. The fact that we've had inflation over the last several years that has led to a price level that means when they're out there shopping for their Christmas dinner and their Christmas presents right now, they're like, what has happened to prices? And they're frustrated. And what Jay Powell said today was the best way to help people with that is to protect the labor market. Let's make sure that they can get the wage growth they need to make sure that their wages are keeping up with the inflation they felt over the last 3 or 4 years, because we want everyone to feel like the economy is working for them.
Well, to what extent could President Trump pull the rug out from under Jay Powell again here when it comes to his tariff regime? Because there are many folks who don't believe that we've actually seen the impact of tariffs yet, thanks to all the front running that took place ahead of these tariffs taking effect. Once we get through the holidays, we get into the new year, Betsy, this could be a different world.
You know, it could be. And we'll come back to what you were just listening to earlier, what's happening to the yield curve. People are like, this world is so uncertain. I'm going to hold something for longer. You better pay me more for it. And I think we all feel that increased uncertainty. I don't know what's going to happen in 2026. Could be good, could be bad. Could it be more tariffs? Could be fewer tariffs. Nobody really knows. And I think, that kind of uncertainty, it's not a great place to be operating an economy in. And if I would give any advice to this administration, it's just make your decisions and stick with them, because the uncertainty is really starting to cost us a lot.
So give us a sense of what 25 basis points means in this environment. Does this even make a dent today?
Not really, right? I mean, obviously people like the decision, but what it was a movement to neutral rates. So we moved to what Powell described as we're at the top end of neutral, but we're still neutral. And when you've got these two competing risks in balance, you should be at the neutral rate. Is this going to be life-changing for anyone? No. Is it going to bring mortgage rates down? It depends, because, again, that uncertainty is putting pressure the other direction. You want a 30-year mortgage? We don't know what's going to happen in 30 years, and maybe we're not ready to reduce mortgage rates. So there are other things besides the Fed's decision on overnight rates that's affecting real people's access to credit. And so I don't know that it's going to change much on the rates end. Is it?
Yeah.
Much on the labor market end? I also think that might be a little bit unpredictable, right? Because the hope is to encourage companies to just go a little bit further, to borrow the money they need to do the expansions they need. Now they can borrow it a little bit cheaper. I think the problem with the labor market, we need more than a 25 basis point cut. And I don't know that that means more in terms of Fed cuts, but it does mean more in terms of other aspects of delivering for the economy, like certainty about where tariffs is going, and like an understanding that, you don't have the president micromanaging individual business deals, right? I don't like the idea that a CEO can call the president to say, hey, I'd like your help with this particular policy. We need a level playing field for all the businesses out there.
Really interesting, Betsy. I'd love to continue this conversation about the AI piece next time you join us. Betsey Stevenson is public policy economics professor at the University of Michigan. We thank you, as always. Coming up, breaking news off the coast of Venezuela. Just moments ago, President Trump confirming Bloomberg's report that the U.S. has indeed seized a large oil tanker at sea. We'll have a full report straight ahead. First, the Senate set to put dueling health care plans on the floor tomorrow in a partisan showdown that may lead to nothing. We'll look ahead to what we can expect when we talk with former Republican Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. On the eve of today's final FOMC meeting of the year, President Trump took the stage in Pennsylvania to tout his administration's progress when it comes to the economy and specifically affordability. Listen.
They gave you high prices. They gave you the highest inflation in history, and we're bringing those prices down rapidly. They say, oh, he doesn't realize prices are high. Prices are coming down very substantially. But they have a new word. You know, they always have a hoax. The new word is affordability. I have no higher priority than making America affordable again. You can give up certain products. You can give up pencils. You don't need $37 for your daughter. 2 or 3 is nice.
But as the president plans to continue the road show here to try to soothe voters' frustration over prices, will he be able to successfully convey the message? A question that's being asked from within and without the White House this evening. And joining us now with insights in this whole affordability discussion on a Fed day here in our Washington bureau is Pat Toomey, former Republican senator from Pennsylvania, used to run the banking committee. It's great to see you.
Joe, it's great to be here.
I've got so much I could ask you about in terms of picking the next Fed chair, what we saw today in the dot plot. What do you make of this argument over affordability? It's the same one we were having in the Biden administration. And this president even went back to your home state of Pennsylvania, where Joe Biden used to try to deliver that message. What is it about your state?
Well, it's our state is very competitive at every political level, right? So certainly the presidential, we will have at least 3 or 4 contested, competitive U.S. House seats races in next year, which, of course, the president cares a lot about. But I think, you know, he just doesn't seem to want to stay on the script he ought to be on, to tell the American people that prices are coming down when, in fact, they are going up. A president will lose that argument because people see with their own eyes what they pay at the checkout counter, and you're not going to be able to tell them they're seeing something different than that.
And we've seen this movie before.
And we have totally seen this movie before. It's also, you know, one of the reasons why it's so strange that the president continues to beat up the Fed and talk about how much they need to lower rates. My own view is that the Fed probably shouldn't have made this move today, and yet they did, and we can expect the incoming chair to probably be pretty dovish. That increases the risk of a resurgence of inflation, which is by far the biggest political risk that the president faces, and yet that's what he's courting. So it's perplexing, as things often are.
So is
Joe.
this Fed looking at the job market in favor of inflation?
You know,
are you worried about jobs?
So the job picture looks like we're basically flat. We're not creating jobs. I have to wonder how much of that is because we have no immigration. If there are no people to take the jobs, then you're not going to create jobs. Other indicia of the economy is that things are in pretty good shape. There's other reasons why it's perplexing that the Fed would cut rates here. I mean, the idea that we have restrictive monetary policy that's a tough sell when financial assets are at or close to all-time highs. Gold is close to an all-time high. Credit spreads are extremely tight. GDP growth is strong. And now we've got the, Fed funds rate, we'll say 3.5 to 3.75. Well, a lot of folks think GDP growth could be close to 3% next year. So the real rate, so we're growing. Nominal GDP is well above the short-term rates. And meanwhile, we've seen since the Fed started cutting that the long end of the yield curve has actually gone up. The curve has steepened.
We were just talking about that.
And so all of this, to me, it adds up to a good reason to say, let's just wait a while here and see how this plays out. Because we don't have a disaster on the job front at all. We don't have large-scale layoffs. We don't have huge new...
You're just not seeing the growth you want.
We're not seeing the growth, but as I say, a combination of productivity growth and low immigration might very well explain it.
Well, so the extremes that are coming out of the White House are pretty remarkable. The president says we should cut from 100 to 150 basis points. Stephen Myron has tried to make that argument as well. Yeah. And he was saying earlier today at a business roundtable that we should allow growth from 20 to 25% GDP growth. Wouldn't that break the wings off the plane?
Yeah, I mean, if you just do the math, right?
Yeah.
GDP growth is, you can look at that as productivity growth times the growth of the workforce. Mm-hmm. Which one of those numbers, what combination of those numbers gets you to 25 is obviously, it's ridiculous. It's not possible to have anything like sustained growth.
Yeah.
In an environment like this. It'd be different if we were coming off, maybe it'd be different if we were coming off the lockdown of COVID, for instance, but there's no way that that's even remotely plausible.
When you talk about the lockdown of COVID, it makes me think about Obamacare subsidies.
Yeah.
We've got a big debate here in Washington. Tomorrow there's going to be a vote. In your former chamber in the Senate, we're going to see a Democratic plan and apparently a Republican plan each get votes. They're both expected to fail, Senator.
Right.
You must have had quite a time watching the longest government shutdown in history from the sidelines here. And this was the very issue that we shut down over. Are we going to come to terms on this, or are we going over the cliff, as they say? To premium?
So first of all, I think the size of the cliff with respect to the Obamacare COVID era subsidy bump up, it's quite a small cliff, in fact, right? There's actually quite few people who are adversely affected, not zero, but it's few in number. This, by the way, was supposed to expire when COVID pretty much went away. It has. It was set to expire at the end of this year. It should.
You favor their
frankly.
expiration?
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you tell people to see premiums going up?
Look, there are probably some narrow category of circumstances where there are problems. An awful lot of the people, by the way, who are going through Obamacare are eligible for employer-sponsored insurance. They could be getting it from their employer. Instead, they go to the taxpayer because Obamacare offers a better deal when you add in all of these subsidies. You might have seen the GAO study that came out very recently on the kind of opportunities for fraud in this space. Right?
So is this an opportunity to put eligibility controls on?
Absolutely.
Or to scrap this and have health savings accounts like some Republicans say?
I would probably prefer the latter, but at a minimum, there ought to be some reforms, right? GAO showed us, right? They created 20 fictitious human beings, submitted applications through the portal for those. 18 of the 20 got Obamacare insurance, zero premium insurance, so it's just money that starts going from the taxpayer to insurance companies for people who don't exist. How can that be okay?
So you back reform?
Totally.
You back replace, like if it's a deal. The worry is, and if you ask somebody like Tony Fabrizio or a Republican pollster, they'll say if this is not addressed, Republicans will lose the House in the midterms.
Well, Republicans are going to have a struggle with the House.
That's a little different than the Senate.
In any case, for a variety of reasons, unless things change dramatically between now and then, which is a distinct possibility. But yeah, look, I think Republicans' challenge has been to articulate a clear, well-defined alternative that people feel like, okay, that makes sense. And we haven't had a consensus among Republicans. We tried hard when I was in the Senate, shortly after Obamacare.
It's been years of this conversation.
And it has been.
30 seconds, saved by the bell. Is Kevin Hassett the next Fed chair?
Who knows, right? There's one. There's one. There's one person who spends a lot of time in the Oval Office.
You think he's at the top of the list as Bloomberg reports?
I think it's very likely.
And you're comfortable with that?
He's a very capable guy, very, very knowledgeable guy. So I think most of the finalists are very well qualified.
He's got the Toomey endorsement. Pat Toomey, former Republican senator from Pennsylvania. It's great to have you with us in studio, Senator, and good to see you. Coming up next, breaking news as the U.S. intercepts an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We have breaking news this evening, a Bloomberg exclusive. The U.S. taking action that marks a significant escalation in tensions between the U.S. and Venezuela after U.S. forces intercepted and seized a sanctioned oil tanker off the Venezuelan coast. The seizure making it much harder now for Venezuela to export its oil, serving as a deterrence for other shippers. The president confirming Bloomberg's reporting a short time ago. Listen.
We've just seized a tanker on the coast of Venezuela, a large tanker, very large. Largest one ever seized, actually. And other things are happening, so you'll be seeing that later, and you'll be talking about that later with some other people.
Joining us now with the latest is the man who broke that story. Bloomberg's Eric Martin covers the State Department for us and foreign policy here in Washington. Eric, great reporting, and thank you for bringing it our way. What do we know about this tanker?
Joe, what we understand from our sources is that this is a tanker that is one of the largest tankers possible for crude oil, holds about 2 million barrels, and up to 2 million barrels. And what we understand is that it was destined for, that the U.S. officials believed it was destined for Cuba. That's significant because when oil goes to China, it's one thing. But when this sanctioned oil goes to Cuba, the U.S. has long suspected that the Cuban government sells this oil onto the black market in order to profit and to share those profits with Caracas and with the Maduro regime. And so this is a big deal that the U.S. has taken this step. Yeah. This is the first time that we've seen the U.S. seize a ship like this. And of course, given that, even though it's a sanctioned ship, given that the contents of the ship belong to someone else, belong to the oil producer or to the country of Venezuela, this is a big step in terms of stepping up the pressure to cut off the Maduro regime from its financing.
Do we know if this ship, this vessel, was seized without incident? Was gunfire exchanged? And what are we going to do with it?
We're still looking for those details. Okay. President Trump, as you mentioned and showed in the clip a moment ago, did acknowledge the news and the story that we broke earlier today. And when asked about what happens to the oil, he said that the U.S., he imagines, would hold on to it. It's not clear what he meant exactly by that. But, of course, once a ship like this, a tanker like this is seized, it comes into U.S. possession, and then the U.S. has to decide, is it going to sell it? Is it going to keep it in the port? All kinds of different questions logistically to be answered.
Of course, there's a crew on that ship. Eric, great job. Bloomberg's Eric Martin. Setting up our conversation with the general, we continue now with the retired four-star Army General Wesley Clark, the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe and former Commander-in-Chief for the U.S. Southern Command, the very region that we are describing. General, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg TV and radio. How significant is this move?
I think it's a very significant move. It is a step up in pressure on Maduro, and it indicates that if he stays in power, he's going to really face much more constrained resources. It's going to make it very difficult for him to pay off his people and do the other things he's been doing. It's just one more push to get him out the door. But it does also make clear, Joe, that the purpose of this is not just counter-narcotics. It is aimed at Maduro, and I hope he understands that very clearly.
Aimed at regime change. What should be done with the crew on this boat, General? And after all the questions about the legality of our striking alleged drug boats coming out of Venezuela, is this in line with the law?
We don't know exactly who the crew is or who the owner of the vessel is. They'll probably be released through diplomatic channels. Vessel will probably be held.
Understood. Is that what should happen to all survivors from boats that we attack?
Well, we've never seen, you're going back to this incident with the double tap. And Joe, the Republicans said in the House said the investigation's over, but the American people have not yet seen the tape or the video. And I think, the administration owes it to the American people to let them know what's happening on this. It's pretty clear now that it's pressure on Maduro. It's going after to show the ability of the United States to strike and use force. Apparently, these people were involved in shipping drugs. That's not the major source of drug shipments into the United States, of course. And some of it may not have been coming to the United States. In this case, apparently it was going to Suriname and then maybe to Europe. But the fact is, the rules of international law, maritime traditional practices, seamen stranded at sea get picked up. They don't get killed.
And I'm not only referring to the double tap strike, General. There were incidents after that where we did help some of those survivors get home. Striking news today. The House Armed Services Committee is ending its investigation into the double tap strike in early September. Is that the right move now?
Depends on what the conclusion of the investigation is. And we still don't really have a conclusion of this. You know, it gets ensnared in politics, but the truth is that when it spills over into something like this that's a potential violation of international law, it's bigger than a House Armed Services investigation and the ability of the chairman to just shut it down. So an explanation owed to the American people, including the use of the video, which some members of Congress found shocking. Others didn't. Let the American people judge this, because the American people will be judged on the actions that President Trump and the U.S. Defense Department or War Department take with respect to Venezuela. We've got Americans all over the world. They'll be confronted by this. They'll be asked about it. They're going to be asked to defend or not defend the actions of the United States government. So let's give the American people a chance to see what's really going on.
Well, here we are. Fast forward to the 10th of December. We've seized an oil tanker. If you're just joining us, that has been confirmed by the President of the United States. I don't know if you expect more of this type of activity on what was described as a stateless vessel, General, but the President's also toyed with the idea of land strikes in his conversations with reporters. Is that what comes next?
It might come next, or it might be demonstrations against Maduro inside Venezuela. Or it might be more seizures. I think it's it's a combination of a plan and then opportunism. But the idea clearly is to put the pressure on Maduro and get him out of town and out of the hemisphere. And ideally, it will be done as peacefully, without riots, without fighting, and so forth. And he'll recognize that his days, as the president said, are numbered. And he's been no friend of the United States. He's brought in hostile potential adversaries from Iran and Russia and Chinese investment and so forth. Under the president's new national security doctrine, we don't want these kinds of people in our hemisphere. But I do have to say, Joe, that despite the new national security doctrine, I mean, Maduro and their presence in the Caracas area and the harbor down there, they're a bunch of mosquitoes. And what's happening in Ukraine is really, really serious. And if it's not handled right, could destabilize Europe and have a huge impact on the United States. And as well as the fact that we've always stood to help those who are fighting for freedom and democracy against tyranny and autocracy. And here we seem to be taking a neutral stance and say, just you boys stop fighting. And there's a lot more to it than that. And our reputation in the world is going to depend on how we settle this. So I hope the president and his team get it right.
Well, I'm glad you went there, General, because there are a lot of questions right now about whether the White House is neutral in this case or, in fact, leaning towards Russia. What do you think?
I think, you have to be careful on something like this, not to lean too far forward. Russia does have important resources. Russia's got a lot of nuclear weapons. It's 140 million people. It's a big country. And, people who have worked this thing for decades, as I have a lot of respect for Russia. And we wish Russia weren't the way it is. But unfortunately, under Vladimir Putin, it's an aggressor nation. And there's no democracy there. Any dissent is harshly punished. There's a tremendous indoctrination program going on for its young people. Its military industries are running 24/7. You'll see disinformation occasionally leaked out. Some came out today saying, well, now Russia really wants to be with the United States. We don't want to be so dependent on China. But, here's the thing, Joe. If Russia really wanted that, all they have to do is stop fighting. Ukraine stops fighting. There's no Ukraine. Russia stops fighting. All doors are open, once the reparations and the abducted children and so forth, but everything can be settled, presumably. All Russia has to do is stop fighting, and then they don't have to worry about being too dependent on China. So we have to understand what the balance here is, and I think, the administration has to be very careful not to look too far forward in getting in a relationship with Russia at the cost of our values and our European allies. Even though there's a lot of problems in Europe and everybody acknowledges, they've got debt, they've got this, they don't have the same growth rate, they don't have the innovative industries, fine. But there are people who share our values, our language. They work with us, and I'm sure we can, if we wanted to, we could take those 500 million people and lift them up. It would be a lot easier lift than dealing with Vladimir Putin.
Speaking from his deep experience, retired four-star Army General Wesley Clark, we thank you, sir, for being with us once again on Bloomberg. Coming up, Australia's social media ban for kids under 16 took effect today, paving the way for more global digital restrictions. We'll bring you the details on that. And a Democrat winning Miami's mayoral contest for the first time in nearly 30 years. We'll talk about what that means for Republican messaging ahead of the midterms with our political panel. They're up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We'll turn back to all the breaking news out of Washington today. First, the stories we're following in today's Power Brief. Today is the day Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth ordered the Navy to complete its review of Democratic Senator Mark Kelly after the retired Navy captain took part in a video urging service members to disobey illegal orders. He was joined by 5 other Democratic lawmakers. Now, Democratic members of the Senate Armed Services Committee, other than Kelly, penning a letter to the Navy Secretary expressing serious concerns about the investigation, saying the review is inappropriate, threatens the separation of powers, and amounts to a purely political exercise. Hegseth has said the review of Kelly's actions may include recall to active duty for court-martial proceedings. Hundreds of thousands of Australian teenagers woke up their social media accounts deactivated this morning as a nationwide teen social media ban went into effect, the ban mandating that companies like TikTok and Instagram keep users under 16 off of their services or face big fines up to $33 million US. Australia might be setting the precedent for other countries, eyeing similar laws, with policymakers in New Zealand, Denmark, and Italy already looking to rein in big tech's hold on younger demographics. Don't tell the kids. And Eileen Higgins has won Miami's mayoral election, becoming the first Democrat to lead the city in nearly 3 decades and the first woman to ever hold the job. Higgins led Trump-endorsed Republican candidate Emilio Gonzalez by more than 18 points. Quite a contrast from last year when Trump won the city by 11. Her campaign focused on cutting corruption at City Hall while improving housing affordability and public transit. The victory adding to the recent stretch of Democratic gains ahead of the midterms next year. Along with last month's governor wins in New Jersey and Virginia, this comes as President Trump works to reframe his administration's messaging when it comes to affordability and the economy. And to that end, joining us now, our political panel. Roger Fisk, Democratic strategist, former aide to President Obama, alongside Republican strategist Maura Gillespie, founder, principal, Blue Stack Strategies. It's great to see both of you, and welcome. Roger, President Trump decided to leave the bubble to get around this very issue of affordability, which he refers to a Democrat con job, a Democrat hoax. The people of Miami don't seem to feel that way. What do you make of the outcome in this mayoral contest?
Yeah, you could, calling it a hoax pre-New Jersey and pre-Virginia probably would have been one thing, but as they say in economics, 2 points is a line, 3 points is a trend. There's proof of concept here. And I guess he's maybe trying to say that the term itself is some kind of a hoax because he's not necessarily questioning the underpinnings of it. And the most important thing that proves that he knows the economy is not good is the complete embargo that the administration has put on job numbers and reporting some of the basic stats that all of us are used to getting. Because I think we can all agree if it was good numbers, he'd be singing it from the rooftops. So that's what I think is going on there. And then to speak specifically about Miami, I'm always a little reluctant to take mayoral elections and extrapolate them nationally. I think governor races are a much better prism for things like that. Mayoral elections tend to be a little bit more like intensely local and tribal and things like that. But 5940 is, a pretty clear blinking red light, especially given the city in which it took place. So I would imagine whether or not the president's concerned about it, I think it's fair to say those around him are concerned about it.
Yeah, and the first time in 30 years is quite a headline. Maura, pull me in off the ledge here because a lot of us are trying to connect the dots between Virginia, New Jersey, Tennessee, and now a city called Miami. Is this a bellwether or not?
You know, in Miami, roughly 21% of registered voters came out to vote. So I think the concern that typically we see with Democrats is normally the apathy to voting. But right now, that's going to be Republicans' biggest problem. If they are not inspired to go out and turn out for votes, this is going to be a problem for 26 and for other races that come up without this inspiration and this motivation to support candidates that are in the Republican field. And I do think a lot of that has to do with the word that the president thinks is now a hoax, but affordability really is what's going to drive people to the polls. And we saw in New Jersey, mostly people came out because they were frustrated by policies by Donald Trump. So it wasn't necessarily a vote for McKee Sherrill, it was a vote against the policies of Donald Trump and his administration.
You keep talking about affordability. It's hard to ignore the Federal Reserve today. We got an interest rate cut. Former Republican Senator Pat Toomey just came in and told us that should not have happened. Should the Fed be more worried about inflation or the job market right now?
I would be more worried being Kevin Hassett right now if I was expected to take.
Answer.
I mean, the idea that you can only take this job if you agree to X amount of cuts, which I think we can all agree that the president's going to have expectations of not 0.25% cuts, right, but like large, really historic level cuts in the interest rate. You know, I think Jerome Powell is going to go down in history as a sober, responsible steward of the economy. When a president is pursuing the tariff agenda that this president is, which has a direct impact, for example, on housing starts. If Canadian lumber is more expensive and concrete and drywall from Mexico is more expensive, that's not going to make housing more affordable, right? So then you need something to counteract that. So in that sense, I think the president's rhetoric undercuts his own economic agenda because his tariffs and how he talks about these things have a direct impact on the costs that American families are facing, and you can see it at the polls.
Well, you can't have a conversation about affordability without including health care, Maura, and that's the big debate right now on Capitol Hill. There are going to be a couple of votes tomorrow, a Democratic plan, a Republican plan with enhanced Obamacare subsidies set to expire at the end of the month. Guess what? Neither are expected to pass. And there's a big argument right now about how this should be handled, whether Obamacare should be replaced or reformed. And there's a Speaker of the House right in the middle of it all, Mike Johnson, who's being pulled in about 100 different directions right now. As someone who worked for a former Speaker in John Boehner's office, how much hot water is Mike Johnson in? He said there'd be a plan on the table this week, and we haven't seen it yet.
I think Mike Johnson has really, unfortunately, not played this very well. He has given over so much control and so much of his gavel power to the president and to the administration, and now he's left, you know, kind of empty-handed as far as producing a plan and a semblance of a plan or a concept of a plan. He doesn't have either of those things, and unfortunately, it does come down to the Senate. And when we had this conversation during the shutdown, you know, I mentioned here on the program about the importance of John Thune looking to people like Senator Bill Cassidy, you know, the Senate leader of the HELP committee, and really looking at it from a committee level and having them flesh out a plan to put forward to resolve the issue. But again, right now we are weeks away, less than just a matter of a few weeks before this, you know, kind of impacts the American people. And unfortunately, you don't have the best results when you're pushed your back against the wall. And so, yes, it's an issue that Republicans need to figure out how to message better on and actually want to address. Without a plan, you can't keep talking about something without actually producing a result or a solution option for people to get behind.
Well, Roger, you worked for Barack Obama. How abstract does it feel? How surreal does it feel? 15 later, this is still boiling on the front burner.
I could make a number of jokes, but the more important thing is that it's interesting in political movements when people get so focused on being against something that it completely eclipses the burden that's on them or the responsibility to actually generate an alternative. We're coming around on 15 years where these folks, either under Speaker Ryan or on through Speaker Boehner, Leader McConnell, on and on, where literally nothing has taken shape. Looking forward briefly, I think there's a glimmer of hope around. I can't believe I'm going to endorse.
Come on.
The evolution I've gone through here, all of a sudden find myself sympathizing with a Cheney and having and feeling warm feelings about Marjorie Taylor Greene. But now I'm going to say something about Senator Moreno and Senator Collins, which is like the idea of maintain the subsidies as is with some income adjustments for 2 years, which pushes it past the midterm, which you would imagine anyone in the House or Senate would. I mean, kicking the can is the business these folks are in, right? So I think that there's something there, and the question is can Collins bring in a Shaheen? Can a Shaheen bring in a Hassan? Can a Moreno bring in a Johnson? You know, can they piece together some kind of regionalism around this question?
Sure. Maura, we've only got about 30 seconds left. Do you see a deal in the making here, or are we going over the cliff, as they say?
If they want to keep any sense of the Republican majority in either chamber, they're going to have to.
Well, short and sweet with Maura Gillespie and Roger Fisk, our great panel. I thank you both for the insights. Today on the early edition of Balance of Power, I spent some time with Gene Simmons. Yes, the legendary KISS frontman and now Kennedy Center honoree. Spent some time in Washington this week at the White House and as well on Capitol Hill to testify before the Senate about music royalties. Here's a taste.
Let's play a game. Who's your favorite recording artist?
KISS.
No, come on. Somebody from the past,
Why can't
present,
we go
or
with
future.
that? All right, Jimi Hendrix.
Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix has never in his entire career or now ever gotten paid a single penny when his music is played on AM and FM radio. The stunning fact is that the Russians and some other countries actually do pay performing artists on radio, land radio, AM, FM, and Americans do not. And this has got to change and should change. AI is a concern if left unregulated. Anything, beautiful horse that you just bring in, if it runs wild, you've got to have some parameters that we control instead of AI. If your thing doesn't work out, what's the backdrop? I know you took ballet lessons. If this doesn't work out,
and I've
you
lost
can
my
get
chops.
up and, do your thing.
I'm not keeping up with it. Who knew? From music royalties to AI, you can find the full conversation with Gene Simmons online or on the terminal. I dare you. Roger Fisk, is Gene Simmons the answer to our partisan fury in Washington?
Clearly.
Seemed very calm about the whole
Clearly. I think he's sagacious.
Well done. Maura, you thought you were saved by the bell. If Donald Trump endorses a bill, this is serious, to have radio companies pay the royalties he's pushing for, does that bill get to the floor?
I mean, if Gene Simmons wants to come to the floor and also convince members, I think yes.
Okay, I think that's a pretty good answer. He was in the Oval this week, He was at the Kennedy Center Honors. He says he's known Trump for years. I think we could get something done here.
He could be in the short running for chairman of the Fed.
Well, I don't know about that. I didn't ask him for his interest rate forecast. You're a musician. I thought more of you, Roger. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online. I wonder if they put the interview in there. Thanks to our great panelists, Roger and Maura, and thank you for being with us. What a day for Balance of Power. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.